Hello and welcome to our David Bradford seminars in energy and environmental policy. I'm Keely Swan, the Assistant Director of C-PREE, which is the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Today's talk is a little different from some of the others in our series. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Steph Speirs, who happens to be an MPA 2014 alum of the school, as well as an entrepreneur. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Steph back when I was working at MIT's PKG Public Service Center when she participated in several of our social innovation programs there. At the time, Steph was in the early stages of launching Solstice, a startup focused on making solar power accessible to low-income communities. I remember being impressed by her ability to understand and navigate the policy spaces that were influencing energy policy locally. It was only after I started working here at Princeton that I realized Steph was also an alum of this institution as well. And I'm so pleased that we were able to find time to welcome her back to the series. Some additional notes about Steph's background. She's a social entrepreneur and community builder with operational experience in the US, Middle East, and South Asia. She's received a number of recognitions for her work, including being selected as an Echoing Green Climate Fellow, a Global Good Fund Fellow, and an Acumen Global Fellow. She previously led sales and marketing innovation initiatives at D-Light India, a solar products company powering areas without reliable electricity. She spearheaded Acumen's renewable energy sector investment strategy in Pakistan. And she has also developed Middle East policy as the youngest director at the White House National Security Council and managed field operations in 7 states for the first Obama presidential campaign. Steph holds a BA from Yale, a Master in Public Affairs with distinction from Princeton, and an MBA from MIT. So before I turn things over to Steph, just a few reminders that we'll be leaving some time at the end for questions, and you can use the Q&A box to submit questions throughout Steph's presentation. We'll invite people to raise their hands at the very end and ask questions live. And so with that, thanks so much, Steph, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, this is Steph Speirs. Hopefully you can see my slides now, and I'm so happy to be with you. It is obviously a pretty dark time in the world, and a lot of you're normal if you're in a moment of despair, but I think also this is a time of great hope that things can change for the better for the future. And I have seen that no more than in the space of climate justice and energy equity. I have never heard this number of people in the industry talk about climate justice and energy equity as they have in the last few months. And there are a lot of reasons why this is now suddenly a trending topic, but it's also the outcome of many years of policies that need to be changed. And so what I'll be taking everyone through in this presentation is kind of, let's talk about who is the low to moderate income customer in energy, and then we'll talk about inefficiencies and problems that LMI customer is experiencing. And then we'll talk about some of the financing innovations that Solstice has been working on, and then other innovations that are required to make energy more equitable. This is by no means comprehensive. There's a lot we can do, but I wanted to focus on a couple of topics that will see more traction and play, particularly depending on the political outcome in 10 days, actually. So without further ado, let's talk about who is the low to moderate income customer in energy. And I think the biggest misconception that people have about the low to moderate income household in America is that it is a minority of the country. And it's actually much more common than you would think. So what is low to moderate income, or LMI? Well, it's kind of defined by area median income. And low income is generally defined by 50% or less of the area median income. Moderate income is defined by 51 to 80% of the area median income. And so it's really determined by localities. To give you an example, in 2017, numbers from the census, the median income in the United States was $57,000. And so what does that mean? Well, moderate income would be households that make less than $46,000, and low income would be, under this definition, less than $28,000. So There are a lot of places across the country where people are LMI. In any of these major cities, anyone who makes at or below the income shown here qualify as low to moderate income. And these jobs are way more common than you would think, LMI jobs. So they're factory workers, they're teachers, they're loan officers, they're servers, they're retail managers, they're farmers, they're flight attendants, they're mail people. And the commonality here is also, who are we talking about here? We're talking about essential workers, the people who are keeping us alive as a society right now. They're the ones who are low to moderate income Americans. And when you look at low to moderate income distribution across the country, this is looking at census tracts. And so in the red, you see lower than median income census tracts. And in the blue, you have higher than median income census tracts. And you can see that if you were to zoom in, even on the blue areas, which tend to be cities, if you were to zoom in on the cities, you would see each city has huge swaths of red as well. And so we're talking about people all across the country in every state that are disproportionately affected. And so what we talk about when we say poor, this is generally defined by the federal government as about less than $25,000 a year as an income as a family of four. And that's 12% of the country that falls under this category. And when we talk about LMI, we are talking about about U.S. households that earn less than $50K nationally. Just a reminder, the true LMI definition, according to HUD, is actually 80%, less than 80% of area median income. So you can't have a national definition of LMI. It's defined locally. But generally, when you take that benchmark, about 42% of the country falls below that benchmark. And when you look even at a higher income level, U.S. households, a family of four that earn collectively less than $75,000, that's 58% of the country earning less than that salary as a family of four. So the takeaway here is this market is large and will only increase with COVID. So anytime someone says, oh, we can't do low income and energy, that's too niche, that's not scalable. The question that we should be asking anyone who says that is, look, it's actually the majority of the country that is struggling to make it. And we will never solve climate change until we democratize access to clean energy for these populations. So why is energy equity important at all? Well, countless studies show that low to moderate income households, that group, the majority of Americans or a huge chunk of Americans that we just talked about, they are disproportionately affected in a number of ways. So first off, they have a higher energy burden, meaning they pay a bigger portion of their salary on energy. And we'll get into specific numbers later, but they have a significantly higher energy burden than higher income households. They suffer more from air pollution and asthma, and now COVID. They are disproportionately dying, and lives are on the line. And it is our moral imperative to care about that and not turn a blind eye to it. They are closer to polluting industrial sites, coal fire plants, oil refineries, natural gas facilities. They live closer to them. And we'll see later in this discussion, clean energy projects are generally not sited near low-income communities. You have low-income communities sited next to polluting power plants. And as we've seen, unfortunately, with wildfires and flooding across the country, and it's worse than ever right now, low-income communities are suffering disproportionately from extreme weather events. And so they're on the front lines of climate change. And, people sometimes are saying that the pandemic is treating us like everyone experiences the pandemic and has negative impacts, but we have to acknowledge that, not all, we're in the same ocean, but not all boats are equally equipped to deal with climate change, and some boats are affected more than others. So some energy burden facts. Low-income customers pay 17 to 50% of their income on energy. And that is approximately a 3x higher energy burden than other non-low-income customers. And studies show that low-income households pay their utility bill as long as they possibly can. So low-income customers generally get a bad rap for just being entirely inconsistent in their bill behavior. And when you're talking about 42% of the country or sometimes more, you can't paint such a large swath of the country with the broad brush. We need to be more precise. Yes, there are households that cannot pay their utility bills on time, for sure. That's largely because we're, as a society, not paying them enough, or we're not supporting them enough. But there are also a bunch of low-income households that are paying their utility bills on time and not really getting any credit for it. But they're definitely getting penalized for it. Also, we're talking about, this is a graph from a Berkeley study that was in the publication Science. And it shows that the poorest third of US counties will likely lose up to 20% of their incomes as a result of climate change. And when you look at this map, you can see the areas that are most affected by climate change in terms of economic damage in red. And so you have climate change affecting the poorest counties the most, but also the southern part of the US the most, which are also more low income than other greener portions of this country. And so there's another aspect of energy equity, is the question of who gets to benefit from clean energy. And right now, it's generally high-income homeowners. It's not only high-income homeowners, but it's high-credit homeowners. So who gets to get rooftop solar? Who gets to get pay more for access to wind power? It's generally higher credit, higher income, more affluent folks. And yet, we need to create a world where people can get access to clean energy regardless of their rooftop, regardless of their income, and regardless of any other marker of privilege. That's the only way we're going to get to 100% renewable or clean. And so we have to go from getting clean energy only to high credit homeowners and figure out how to serve people like underserved renters. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how to get there. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the racial component of clean energy access. And it's not a coincidence that we see a lot fewer folks of Black and Brown heritage who don't get access to clean energy. And this is a study that showed up in Nature. And essentially, neighborhoods where African Americans make up at least 50% of the population have installed 69% less rooftop solar than neighborhoods with no racial majority. And okay, that's Black Americans. What about Latinx? Well, neighborhoods where Latin Americans make up at least 50% of the population have installed 30% less rooftop solar than neighborhoods with no racial majority. Okay, well, what about, how does that compare to white neighborhoods? Majority white neighborhoods have installed 21% more rooftop solar than neighborhoods with no racial majority. So the inequities we see in the rest of society that we're having a reckoning with across the country right now are reflected in who gets clean energy access. And when you think about the fact that clean energy is booming and the benefits of clean energy are incredible if you can just get your hands on it, if we start to replicate the inequities in society with clean energy access, well, then we're going to make our inequality in this country worse. And there will be higher costs that we as society will have to pay later if we don't address this problem now. To say nothing of, it is the moral thing to do to care about this inequity and get people who are most marginalized more access. So there are a few takeaways here. Like I mentioned, we will never mitigate climate change unless we democratize access to clean energy and energy savings. We will never achieve 100% renewable or clean energy without an intentional focus on underserved communities, meaning this is not going to happen organically on its own. And what will happen on its own is the green revolution. You know, in the last 2 years, we've gone from only 2 states in the country having 100% renewable or clean standard. That was Hawaii and California 2 years ago, to now 1 out of 3 Americans lives in a state that has 100% renewable or clean standard. That's pretty cool in such a short amount of time to go for so much of the country that is now under this mandate. But these states are passing these mandates and they're not exactly sure how they're going to get there. And we have to intentionally implement tools that increase access, or we will never reach that 100% standard. lastly, the people that need solar savings the most, the people that need clean energy savings the most, the people that need to benefit from the green transition the most are currently the least likely to get these services. So to recap, low-income households are disproportionately affected by climate change. They're disproportionately affected by air pollution and now COVID. They're disproportionately paying a portion of their salary on energy, and they're also disproportionately locked out of clean energy. We have to change this to move forward. So what communities are the most vulnerable? Well, this is a map by Microsoft and JVon, and they looked at where communities are the most vulnerable to COVID morbidity. And they found that the most heavily weighted, most frequent determining risk factor for COVID mortality was air quality. And so this is a disparity that we're living every single day and we're witnessing every day. And we cannot sit back anymore and do nothing when there's so much we could do to address this. Speaking of, in COVID, everything I said before was true before COVID. And now that COVID has arrived at our doorsteps, things are getting worse. I promise that I will have more of an uplifting message at the end, but let's just get in touch with reality here, which is that millions of Americans are right now at risk of losing power and water because they're not paying their utility bills. More than 179 million people may be at risk for shutoffs as many state protections end. This was just from a couple weeks ago in the Washington Post. And essentially, according to the trade organization that administers LIHEAP, the Low Income Heating Energy Assistance Program, federal program, they say that 20% of Americans are currently not paying their utility bills on time. This is fresh from data from about a week ago. So in this country right now, 20% of Americans are not able to pay their utility bills, and it's getting worse. And state moratoriums on energy arrears, meaning state cutoffs that won't allow energy to be cut off from people who aren't paying their bills, the moratorium on that, they're expiring as we speak. And so we need to either renew these moratoriums or we need to inject a lot more money into federal energy assistance to allow people to pay their utility bills so that they don't go hungry or they don't get their energy shut off during this horrible period in their lives. Utility bills have also increased during COVID. So not only are people unable to pay their bills more than ever, but the Union of Concerned Scientists found that the average family could see their bill increase 25% this year over past summers. And that's about $50 a month for some people. Separately, another company in the community renewable space, Arcadia, estimates that all top 13 metro areas in the US will expect to see bill increases from $2 to $37 a month. So at a time where we're struggling financially, people are paying more than ever on their bills. Lastly, these effects are increasing for people who are of Black and Latinx backgrounds. So LMI households facing increased housing hardship, such as evictions, delayed rent or mortgage payments, and unexpected utility payments and home repairs during the pandemic, it's affecting Black and brown people in this country the most, according to a study that the Washington University did, where they only looked at low-income households in this study. So that's all to say that we are called to take action on behalf of these customers. And I want to share the story of one of our customers from New York. This is Joan. And she said on Getting Clean Energy that I never even thought that I could. I live in an apartment. It's owned by someone else. So I just assumed that if they wanted to go solar, they would have, and I didn't have a choice. And she also said that I think any money that you can save, it will all add up. And she said, listen, I don't have all that much. I don't make a lot at work. And I'm grateful to get savings anywhere I can. Joan's a single mother. She didn't realize that solar was for her because generally solar isn't sold to people like her. And so when we signed up her for community solar, it kind of blew her mind that she could benefit from clean energy and save money on her electricity bill. So let's talk about the inefficient. Now that we talked about who the LMI customer is and some of the kind of hardships that they experience on a daily basis with their energy, let's talk about the inefficiencies and problems out there in getting them the relief they need. So when we were working on low-income solar projects in Massachusetts, we were signing customers up for a community solar farm that only helped them. They would save 20% on their electricity bills. They would support a local clean energy farm. They didn't have to pay anything up front. It was a guaranteed discount compared to what they're paying the utility. And we still saw a lot of struggles in getting low-income customers signed up. And so sharing some lessons from that. Eligibility requirements are really tough. So whenever you have a low-income program in energy, you have to pay attention to who is eligible for these programs and what is the burden of proof that people have to go through to be eligible, and what's the application process. So it used to be in Massachusetts that you could only sign up if you were on another public assistance program, and you had to be signed up through the utility already for your discount rate that are offered to low-income customers. And you had to sign up for that discount rate first before you could sign up for low-income clean energy community solar. So we found when we went out to the communities that customers who were eligible had no idea about energy assistance programs. They didn't understand how to sign up. They didn't realize they could be eligible for a discount rate, but they didn't know they had to be sign up for a discount rate before they could sign up for community solar. And it was so convoluted. And you can believe the sign up process was very manual, very confusing. Plus, a lot of states make customers enroll every single year for these energy assistance programs, and people don't know that they have to renew their participation in energy assistance. And so there's also another problem with low-income energy customers that everyone working on this topic should know, which is that home internet penetration is pretty low when we're talking about low-income customers, that we were surprised how few of them had access to the internet at home. And so an entirely digital experience sometimes wasn't appropriate, even though in the energy industry, you hear that software is going to transform everything. That's true. But we have to remember the people who are getting left behind, who don't even have a basic access to the internet. There was a foreign language barrier too. We had to write our entire software and make it into Spanish for this particular area because few people spoke English. And so a lot of these energy assistance programs the materials are only available in English. And so something basic like translating this into different languages could increase access to energy assistance. And we need better bill consolidation on the utility bill or better paper billing systems to include more people. So even when you have a policy in place for a state that says, yes, let's get more low-income population solar, you have to really think about the implementation of the program in order to maximize participation. So for an example, this is the eligibility numbers for the low-income heat and energy assistance program, LIHEAP. And you see the number of people who are actually eligible range from 28 million to 35 million in this country. The number of people who actually get LIHEAP in this country is close to around 6 million households. So there's a belief from the people who administer this program that these programs are way underfunded. So when we say we have to invest in frontline communities, there are some people that we can sell community solar to because they pay their bills on time. There's some people who can't pay their bills at all. And we need to increase funding for LIHEAP in order to give those households assistance. So investing in frontline communities sometimes means you can make a return. Sometimes means that you have to just have grant programs, and we have to be precise about who is best served by different programs. But we have to increase our investments in all of them. So right now, because COVID relief has been stalled in our federal government, thanks to a feckless Congress, we actually have not been able to approve extra energy assistance for all those homes that cannot pay their electricity bills on time right now. And it's having an effect on people's livelihoods and whether they can keep their lights on right now. And that's why we should care. Energy efficiency. This is probably an audience of people who are very familiar with energy efficiency and the effect it can have on low-income households. And so it's not a very sexy topic these days. I think people much rather talk about things like AI and IoT, home devices in the energy space, and smart meters. But good old-fashioned energy efficiency needs to be a part of any future plan to help low-income households in a new environment or any new investment environment. And so you have a number of different programs that already exist out there. But, of the total US electric energy efficiency spending, only 6% was dedicated to low income programs. And And low-income households have the potential to save a ton through energy efficiency because they live in households that are less efficient and leak air. And so their energy bills are higher than they even should be because they live in such inefficient housing. So energy efficiency will really go far to help low-income customers. And we need to invest more in that. And we're talking about an average of $24 per household in the United States, according to the EIA. So these are investments we can make, and they will make a lot of difference in people's lives. I'm going to speed through this for the interest of time, but I will say that there are a lot of barriers to energy efficiency for low-income customers. So high upfront costs, creditworthiness requirements, split incentives between renters and landlords to invest in energy efficiency upgrades are all huge problems for why low-income households don't enroll even more in available energy efficiency programs. We'll talk about on-bill financing in a sec. There's also social barriers. There's a lack of trust between low-income communities and utilities or energy companies, and that's a pretty big obstacle to reaching vulnerable communities. And there's a good reason there's a lack of trust. A lot of energy companies haven't necessarily treated low-income communities very well or paid a lot of attention to low-income communities. And there's a lot of distrust of energy companies in general. People don't understand how we get energy, but especially with low-income communities, more energy community engagement needs to happen to get over this lack of trust. Plus, there's scheduling difficulties, language and literacy barriers, internet penetration problems I mentioned earlier, and also immigration status can create roadblocks to getting people assistance. So there's also a lack of good data, a lack of comprehensive data on demographics. A lot of utilities have no idea who is actually low income in their own service territory. Lack of good data around energy usage. It is really hard. As the CEO of a solar software company, I can tell you it is extremely difficult to get access to people's energy usage data. And part of it is that utility backend systems are not very sophisticated. Part of it is that there was an aborted green button policy. Green button was a way for people to access their own utility data and share their own utility data with other providers. That was a policy that happened in the last administration, but they only got to about 40% of the utilities in the country. They never actually got to a complete percentage. So that needs further investment. And program statistics makes it really difficult to design and deliver effective programs to households that need services the most. The EDF says that with the right policies in place, states and utilities can make it easier for low-income households to access opportunities to cut their energy use by 20% or more. It creates jobs as well. And we can save a lot of money on electricity and cut carbon emissions substantially. And so when we talk about energy assistance and energy equity, we need to include low income as part of the discussion here. There are a lot of different kinds of programs. I talked about just federal programs, but there are ratepayer funded programs for utility areas. There are statewide programs, there are local programs. And so there are a lot of intervention points that we can invest in. The takeaways here, sorry about the slides. We have 3 takeaways. So energy assistance is highly parochial, decentralized, and local. This is the maddening part of working on energy is energy regulations are really, really localized. There's no unified energy policy. And so we have to take this kind of regulatory fight at both the federal level as well as the state and local level. The data exists in separate databases and billions in funding are available, but we need to create more software innovations that allow us to access data more easily, especially around low-income households' energy usage and their home metering use as well. And we need more innovation in software, user experience, and program administration that can catalyze low-income adoption of existing utility-led programs. And so these are just learnings that we've had. Generally speaking, I wanted to chat with this whole group about what we're learning across the whole industry. And now I'll talk about specifically what are some of the things that Solstice has worked on for a few minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. So first, Solstice is a community solar company. And the idea is that you don't have to put solar on your own rooftop because actually very few people can put solar on their own home. 4 out of 5 Americans are locked out of the rooftop solar market. Maybe they're a renter or a condo owner, or maybe there's a tree covering their roof, or maybe their roof is facing the wrong way, or it's made out of the wrong materials like slate. Maybe they don't have the financing to pay for the $10,000 to $40,000 up front it's going to cost to put solar on their home. Or maybe these households, they don't have the right FICO credit score to get access to solar financing. Little known fact, you have to have a FICO credit score of 680 or 700 and above in order to get access to solar financing or a lot of community solar projects in this country. And FICO was invented in the 1950s as a measure of objective creditworthiness, but it is not objective. It is biased towards people who own homes. It's biased towards people who have good credit card debt and mortgages. And you can have a $500,000 mortgage and you would have a higher FICO score than someone who pays their rental bills on time every month, because FICO doesn't measure whether you pay your utility bills, your cell phone bills, or your history, your rental history, your utility history, or your cell phone history. It just measures whether you pay really your mortgage and credit cards. And so there are a lot of people who don't have the right FICO score who pay their utility bills on time, and we can sign them up, millions more Americans. So Solstice, I'll get back to the credit score in a second, but essentially what our core business model is, we partner with solar developers and we take care of every step of the customer experience for them, from customer enrollments and customer management. So we educate households about community solar, we plug them into local solar farms, and then for the next 20 years, we manage the customer experience and the billing and the crediting and the integration with utility accounts. We manage that all in our software platform. And so basically, like I said, FICO scores determine our destiny in America, even in energy, and they're archaic. And there are all these people who have not the right FICO credit score. We're talking about over half the country doesn't have that 680, 700 FICO credit score. So a lot of people right out of the gate are locked out of rooftop solar and community solar. And when we looked at the data, we found that utility repayment history is not the same depending on your FICO score, meaning your FICO score isn't necessarily correlated to how good you are at paying your utility bill. So at the high end, people who have good FICO scores are generally paying their bills on time. That makes sense. They have really high FICO scores for a reason. They're paying all their bills. But then on the lower end of the FICO bill scale, you have customers with pretty poor relatively FICO scores, but they've never been delinquent on their utility payments over the last 12 months. So we looked at this data and we had this insight, well, why don't we use utility repayment history and other alternative data to qualify people for solar? Why are we relying on this archaic standard of utility scores, credit scores? And so we looked at the people who have low credit and low income, but still pay their utility bills on time. And we use that to create a new qualification standard called the EnergyScore. So the EnergyScore is a more accurate at predicting who pays their utility bills compared to FICO, and it's more inclusive of low to moderate income Americans than FICO. So to recap, you can be more accurate at predicting who pays their utility bills on time, and you can be more inclusive of millions more low-income Americans and get them community solar and get them rooftop solar just by getting rid of FICO and using a different standard. So we're at Solstice trying to think of a world in which we can be more inclusive with our low-income inclusion in renewable energy, and it doesn't have to hurt business. It doesn't have to hurt returns too. So alongside all the important state investments, local investments, federal investments we have to make in frontline communities and relieving the energy burden, we can also do things in business that catalyze the market to be more inclusive, like the EnergyScore. And this is just some data to show that it's the EnergyScore after looking at 800,000 lines of data. I didn't do this. Our smarter friends at MIT and Stanford, data scientists there, found this data that FICO is worse than the EnergyScore at including low-income customers. Lastly, there's more innovation that's required of this space. When we talk about investing in frontline communities, we also have to have more renewable energy projects that are community-led and community-owned. Community-led is the first step. We need to have communities that are on the front line of climate change be a part of the development process. So often when we have low income projects in solar, and there are not that many in the country, let me tell you, we need more of them. But even if we have a few here and there, they're rarely led by the communities they're purporting to serve. It's kind of like more of a process where the developer and financier will put their project together, and then they'll bring it to the community right after you get kind of permitting or approval from interconnection. And that's frankly too late to include the community, because we have to include their voices earlier if we want to say that we're serving them. The next stage that we need to get to is we need to figure out community-owned models of renewables, because that will enhance local communities' resilience to climate change. Community-owned renewables is kind of like the dream for everyone who works in environmental justice, because it's really hard. Community-owned renewables means that either the community themselves have to put up the upfront capital to build the project, or there has to be a transfer of benefits from the people who are capitalizing projects to the people who are suffering the most from climate change. And so there needs to be an important philanthropic component, a government component, as well as a private sector component to something like a community or owned renewable. Secondly, pre-development costs. The reason why there's so few renewable projects in frontline communities, cited in frontline communities, is because those pre-development costs, that community engagement I talked about earlier on in the process, is expensive. It costs money to go out into communities and solicit their opinions and their input on how much in savings they need to see, where a project should be sited. And we believe that if you involve the community on the front end, it will pay off in the long term. The long term, these higher pre-development costs will be more than adequately compensated, because when you have the community involved, a project is much more sustainable. But in the short term, these pre-development costs need to be subsidized in some way. And so that's where you see a lot of state policies trying to provide incentives to developers and financiers to get a higher compensation rate for engaging in low-income projects and covering those higher pre-development costs. New York State is a very good example of this. Massachusetts is starting to do it too. New Jersey, Maryland, Illinois, they've all implemented policies that have allowed developers to get a higher price if they're doing a low-income project, and that's where we need to get to. Because when we talk about low-income participation in renewables, we're talking about risk. There's a perception by developers and financiers that they're higher risk. Part of why we have the EnergyScore is so we can better quantify that risk. But we also need to make sure that policy is supportive of developers and financiers taking on what they perceive to be higher risk. And lastly, citing renewable projects in frontline communities. Very few of the 2 gigawatts of community solar that have been built in just the last few years have been cited in Black and Brown communities. And so we need to see more policies that incentivize the siting of renewables in frontline communities. California is a great example of doing that more. And we need to take the intentional steps to put renewables in frontline communities, because the people who benefit from these farms should be the people who are most affected by climate change. I'm gonna skip over some of these other ideas like on-bill financing, demand response, just so I can get to your questions. But I want to thank you all for being interested in this topic. We're being tested every day during COVID, and we could go down 2 roads. This could be the moment where we make things get better, or this could be the moment right before things get worse, and things have to get worse before we're catalyzed as society to do better. And I hope we choose the former option, and your actions will help us get there. And so thank you for your interest in energy equity and climate justice. I'll pause here.
Great. Thank you so much, Steph, for a wonderful presentation. I think at this point, we will allow people to raise their hand and we can call on you to ask your questions live. Just to give people an opportunity to start to do that or to submit questions in the Q&A. Steph, my question for you. So you pursued an MPA at Princeton and are now an entrepreneur, which in some ways seems like an interesting career path that you've chosen. And so I was wondering if you can talk about kind of that decision, like what role did your policy education play in the work that you're doing now, and what advice do you have for current students?
Yeah, I happened to also go to business school. So it was fascinating to go to both public policy school and to go to business school because you realize when you take classes like microeconomics or finance that these two schools teach the same topics very differently. And it's indicative that sometimes our separate worlds never talk to each other. They even speak a completely different language. And so you have activists and the environmental justice community and public policy makers speak energy equity in very much moral terms and in a moral imperative. And that's so important. But on the other hand, you have market-driven people, businesses, the developers and financiers who are very much like commercial real estate developers building these projects, and they have to make their returns for their capital providers. And so part of the problem and why we're not seeing the outcomes that we want to for low-income Americans is that these two worlds never talk to one another. And so it was I used to work in government before going to Princeton, and then afterwards decided to try the private sector. And I kind of see my life probably oscillating between both. But I always playing that cultural translator role, that it's more important. That sanctuary is really important in our lives. Like it's important that we find our people who share our values, and that's where we build power, and that's where we organize and build coalitions. But real change comes not from preaching to the choir, but leaving our silos and being cultural translators and trying to convince other people that equity and justice belongs in every single industry, not just the public one.
Thank you. So let's go to our Q&A. We have, I think one of the questions at this point is just if you could talk a little bit more about the balance between federal and state incentives. You mentioned that there's a lot of different incentives at all different levels, but what kind of energy policies are incentivizing solar and renewable energy?
Yeah, so we have not actually had that much in federal policy directly affect the community solar industry, except the part of federal policy that's really in play here is the ITC, the investment tax credits. This idea that if you're building solar or a renewable facility, then you can get 30% of the installation costs as a tax credit. And it's led to a lot of tax equity investors who help finance not community solar, but all renewable energy projects. And that's really catapulted the industry to grow faster. Other than that federal policy and then the unfortunate steel and solar tariffs that have been implemented by this current administration, that's increased costs of installation. You see most of the action on renewable energy happen at a state and local level, which is great in a situation right now where the federal government is not that supportive at all about renewables. You still have a path to progress on a state and local level. And so the state and local level, you can do a lot of things like you can mandate that that public funds be used for disadvantaged communities. Actually, part of the Biden climate plan that blew my mind when I read it, it says that $2 trillion will be committed to clean energy and infrastructure. And all 40% of all the clean energy investments and installation will go to disadvantaged communities. So think about that. 40% of all clean energy that a potential future administration is committing to will go to disadvantaged communities. No one has ever seen that kind of commitment on environmental justice. So that's like a federal policy that could be implemented. But on a state level, you have, like I mentioned, more states becoming 100% renewable or clean. You have states mandating low-income access to clean energy, mandates and carve-outs tend to be a little less effective at catalyzing the market to be more sustainably inclusive, because carve-outs are seen by developers as just, this is a loss. I'm going to give away the solar for free. I'm not going to even consider it. I'm just going to write it off as a loss. And so if you do something like an adder, or you incentivize those pre-development costs instead, that allows for more of the market to grow organically and include low-income customers. So those are just some examples, but there's a lot of things like funding for energy efficiency and on-bill financing that come at the state and local level too.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Kang Tong. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, Steph. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. Really learned a lot, because my work is also, part of my work is also on energy use, just inequality and inequity in investment, specifically looking at efficiency. And I actually have two questions. First is, I think you really get the point that low-income communities has been ignored in a lot of the efficiency program. And my study also find out like racial minority who are in the low income are like even worse. So kind of the first question is, have you seen ever good examples that utility, like private utility, because I think municipal utilities may have better understandings about what's going on in the community, but have you seen any private utilities that they had good model reaching out to those low-income, racially diverse groups to help them to explain they are eligible in some programs, or like develop some of these, like just engaging them more? That's the first question. And then the second is about your experience working in public and also private sectors. Is, have you seen like what I have heard is, sometimes cities have good projects, but then they had difficulty to find funders. And then there's people said, oh, the cities, if they had good project, they should be mindful about how to make their project fundable, then they can get more capital investment. And then to the community-wide project, have there any type of help that private company can guide those community project to make the project better better fundable by capital? Then that may help. I just don't know whether this is happening to some extent.
Yeah, so great questions. On the first one with utility programs for low-income customers, specifically around not, like you said, rural co-ops and municipal-owned utilities, but investor-owned utilities. So investor-owned utilities are obviously not all created equal. But there are some investor-owned utilities that are more forward-leaning on low-income inclusion than others. But really, what is the investor-owned utility responding to? Well, they're responding to the incentive structure that are set by regulators. And so if you really want your IOU, your investor-owned utility, to do more on low-income inclusion, you really have to pay attention to who are the regulators on the Public Utilities Commission or the Public Services Commission in your state. And those are the people who are going to hold IOUs accountable. And then there is an element that IOUs are starting to really pay attention to distributed generation as well as more low-income inclusion. But they need to be incentivized, like they need to be compensated by the regulators to work on low-income inclusion, because a lot of the complaints you'll hear from them is that working on low-income inclusion projects are way more expensive than working on mass market projects. I heard from a program administrator for some of the largest energy efficiency programs in the country. They said that their rough estimate for how much more expensive low-income projects are in energy efficiency, kind of marketing and enrollment and program administration, low-income projects are, they said, 8 times more expensive than mass market projects for energy efficiency. So we talked about the moral imperative of serving low-income customers who are most affected by frontline communities. But if we expect IOUs to do that and use their ratepayer funds to cover that 8x cost, we're going to have to fund them more, or we're going to have to provide like regulatory mandates that they have to pay attention to that, because otherwise the pricing structure isn't incentivizing them to do that. There are also some IOUs, some of them, not all of them, some of them are changing and trying to do more for low-income customers. Like, it used to be that all IOUs were lobbying against community solar because they didn't want community solar to grow as an industry. And now in the last year and a half, we've been really pleased to see that now some IOUs are actually doing their own pilots in community solar. And not all programs are great that we've seen come out of utilities. Like, sometimes they charge a premium, but there's more and more interest in doing something, which is very cool. And then to your second question about how do you make these projects more bankable? How do you make them more fundable? When we're talking about low income participation in clean energy, what we're really talking about is risk, right? The perception of risk, and the risk of revenue risk, that I'm not going to get paid if I'm a developer, that I sign up low income customers, they're not going to pay their bill, and I'm just going to get stuck holding the bag. And then there's the churn risk, right? Like, in community solar, generally you can move away and not be penalized for moving away from a community solar farm, and you can give up your spot and someone else can take your spot, but that churn has costs of replacement for the developer. So it all comes down to money, like so many things in the energy industry. And so we have to ensure that either we are keeping the churn rate low, or that risk is borne by others. So Solstice as an entity is bearing a lot of the risk by owning the customer experience. We're responsible for customer replacement. We keep our own churn rates low because we like to treat customers well. The better you treat customers, the less likely they are to churn and leave you. And so excellent customer engagement, excellent customer experience is a big reason why you keep your churn rates low and take on that risk from developers. The other way you can take on risks, the big trend and policy that's growing, is getting different kinds of financial institutions to fund these projects. So you're starting to see more philanthropic funders from family investment offices, high net worth individuals want to get into project financing. But I think a cool innovation that's happening is the green bank movement. Green bank started in Connecticut, New York, and they're starting to talk about a federal green bank. And if you had a green bank is an entity that finances clean energy projects and is okay. It's a public institution, not a private bank. So they can take different kinds of return expectations. And then you can get more of these projects built because people aren't expecting a 20% return. They're okay with a 10% return. So these are some ways to get past these obstacles.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great. So we have another question here, one from Aaron Redding, who's looking specifically at the case of Puerto Rico. So you've mentioned that communities are often, there's a sense of distrust of the utility, and this person cited that that's the case in Puerto Rico with PREPA. And so how do you suggest overcoming that barrier, and who is the onus on to do that? And then the related question is, what are your thoughts on concerns about people defecting from the main grid due to utility distrust?
Yeah, and honestly, the costs of defecting from the main grid are so high that there are not that many people that are able to do that right now, unfortunately, because you have to be able to pay for storage and you have to be able to install solar on your own property. And so really only the most affluent folks are able to do that at the moment. But when we're talking about the United States, it's very different than a situation like Puerto Rico or where I used to work in India. Community solar relies on energy being transmitted through the grid. And so community solar is not really for a place like India and Puerto Rico right now, because you just have to get to a place where the grid works. And I actually worked on microgrids in India. And so where you don't have access to the grid, and where we're seeing a trend in Puerto Rico is microgrids, local community owned or community managed renewable energy farms. And so that is a great interim solution that until the grid gets to your community, then you can still get power, locally distributed power. And, as a whole, the energy industry is moving towards distributed generation, meaning moving away from these centralized power plants that supply everyone their energy and siting power generation closer to where people live and where they're using energy. That's an overwhelming trend. All energy and all utility companies are planning for that future. And so that is the fact that we have microgrids popping up in places like Puerto Rico and India are good because it gives local communities resilience. But we cannot let our kind of foot off the gas on modernizing our grid, making sure it gets to everyone, because ultimately we're going to need those public-private partnerships. And sometimes it makes sense to have a microgrid. Sometimes it makes sense to extend the infrastructure to reach communities, but it's case by case dependent. But we have to get into place policies that allow everyone to get access to a basic functioning need, which is energy.
Excellent. Great. So we have another question here from Hemant about how you take into account cultural diversity. You mentioned that you've worked with a lot of different types of communities. And so how does that play into Solstice's business model and way of working?
Yeah, when I said that there are not enough renewable energy farms that are built in Black and areas where Black and Brown Americans live, like that's kind of what I was getting at, is that we across the board, the energy industry is pretty appalling for diversity. Like if you just look at the workforce, the global energy industry, only 10% of the workforce is women. And in the United States, it's about 25% of the renewable energy industry are women. And then if you talk about Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC communities, that's not even tracked because the number is so minuscule. And so we need to do a lot of work in our own backyard as an energy industry to diversify culturally. How will we ever serve Black and Brown marginalized communities if we don't have any of those folks working in our own industry? So, when we talk about cultural diversity, we have to do things on internally as well as externally. So, I talked about ways to diversify where projects are located, is involving the community earlier, investing in those communities, paying for pre-development costs in those communities, and getting rid of FICO requirements. But it also is incumbent upon every single leader, every single CEO, C-suite person in an energy company to take a hard look at yourselves and try to diversify yourselves. At Solstice internally, we've made strides in recruiting non-dominant groups to work with us. So, immigrant population, differently abled people. We have a fair amount of people of color and women, but we don't do well enough on recruiting Black, Indigenous, and Latinx workers. And so we've been working really hard to change that. And it starts with our own backyard.
Wonderful. So I think we have maybe time for one final question from Sheng Wei, where they're asking, can you say something about the demand side efficiency programs for low income households? So for example, building retrofits, efficient electrical appliances and such.
Yeah. So all the kind of energy efficiency stuff I was talking about earlier was really about that demand side. The other cool innovation that I didn't really get to talk to because I was trying to make sure we had Q&A time was really around this idea of demand response. And utilities, little known fact, utilities are willing to pay people to decrease their energy usage at peak demand times. And that way they don't have to turn on peaker plants. Peaker plants are these plants that are just on standby. And if energy demand exceeds energy supply, then utilities have to fire up these plants. And they're really, really terrible for a couple of reasons. It's really expensive to go from a plant not doing anything to starting to generate power. The startup costs are really expensive. And peaker plants tend to be super polluting. So they emit so much carbon emissions. And so you can decrease carbon emissions and decrease costs of electricity if you don't turn on the peaker plants. So rather than be confronted with energy demand that's increased in a peak moment and then turn on these peaker plants, utilities are willing to pay people to not use electricity. So there's a lot of software innovation that can happen in this space. There's a company called Ohm Connect that does this just for California, but you could foresee it doing it across the country where people get paid to not run their dishwasher that night. And they're alerted on their phones that, hey, why don't you use less electricity if you can, if it's not going to endanger your livelihood, and we'll pay you a little bit of money. And people can earn, $100, $200, $300 a year, which is meaningful for some people. So what I'm trying to say, we're a community solar company. We're obsessed with energy equity, but we don't pretend that community solar is the silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. We have climate change because there are no silver bullets. We need all the solutions. And that's why I think this energy industry is so exciting, because there's so many ways everyone can help.
Perfect. Great. Well, so thank you so much, Steph. This was really a wonderful presentation, a great conversation we had with you today. At this point, Steph has said she's willing to stick around for a few extra minutes. If you wanted to chat with her informally, we'll end the recording here.